All right. Good morning. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar. This is one in a long series over many years of webinars sponsored by Better Brains for Babies, which is an initiative in Georgia to teach about healthy brain development. I know many of you from various trainings, but there are also some unfamiliar names. For those who don't know me, my name is Diane Bales. I am a professor and extension human development specialist at the University of Georgia, and one of the co-directors of Better Brains for Babies. And I am excited today to introduce you to Dr. Emily Noble, who is an associate professor in nutritional sciences at the University of Georgia. And she's going to talk to us today about the brain and pediatric obesity and some of the current state of the research. So, Emily, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to turn off my camera so that you all can focus on Emily, but I am available. If you have questions that you'd like to put in the chat, I will monitor those and share with Emily at appropriate times. If you have things you want to ask, we will also probably have some time for questions at the end. So welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation and thank you for the introduction. So I am an associate professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences, and I am a nutritional neuroscientist. So my research focuses on how food affects the brain and how the brain regulates eating behavior. I'm a fellow of the Obesity Society, and from that lens, I'm not speaking today officially as a representative of the Obesity Society, but I just wanted to let you know that I'm in the mix in that world. But I thought that today we would talk a little bit about adolescence, early life, obesity, and some of the treatments that are being used, and some of the implications for, we're going to learn a little bit about how the brain regulates body weight and this kind of thing, because I think that we have a lot of misconceptions about obesity culturally in our society. People tend to have this belief that it's, that decisions and choices and lifestyle are kind of everything, but there's a lot that we know now about the brain and obesity that really suggests that there's unconscious things that are happening outside of our control. And that's going to be some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. Feel free to interrupt at any time with questions. I left a lot of, science in, and I would like to try to make some of the stuff digestible. And so if you ever have any questions or need clarification, or I'll do my best. So without further ado, I want to start with a general definition. So obesity is defined by the Obesity Medicine Association as a chronic, relapsing, multifactorial, meaning there's many different causes for obesity, and neurobehavioral disease. And I have this highlighted as this is something that people didn't used to think, right? But anyway, now we know that obesity has everything to do with the brain. Hang on, I got to move this thing out of the way. Wherein there's an increase in body fat, promotes body fat tissue dysfunction and abnormal fat mass, resulting in adverse metabolic, biomechanical, and psychosocial health consequences. So obesity wasn't defined as a disease until 2013. And a lot of this had more to do with insurance and obesity medicine and being able to treat obesity than anything else. This has been not without controversy. There are many people who don't think that obesity should be characterized as a disease. It is the case that you can be obese and healthy. However, in the large majority of cases, especially with severe extreme obesity, often there are health consequences, and these health consequences are largely difficult, very, very difficult to treat, very, very difficult to reverse. Oops. So what about pediatric obesity and how is it defined? In adults, we know that BMI, body mass index, is how we define obesity. There's a lot of problems with this as well. So this is based on a calculation, which is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. I was in Walgreens one day, and they were offering free BMI testing and they were charging $20 for it. And and at the time I'm like, wait a minute, you don't need a special, you just need to know your weight and your height. And then you can go online. If you don't want to do these conversions, you can go online and just put it into a BMI calculator and you can get your BMI. So I do not recommend paying $20 for a BMI test at Walgreens. But anyway, you can get your BMI tested there. But in adolescence, we use what's called, we use body mass index, we use growth charts because children, they're on a growth curve, and that means that their weight and their height are going to follow this trajectory. We all know, like little 5-year-old kids, they get really big heads, their brains get really big. They kind of grow a big head and then they grow up. So it doesn't follow the same. So we use these percentiles to characterize obesity. And in 2022, they had to expand these charts to include severe obesity. So it didn't used to be a part of this chart, even because we're seeing children ages 2 to 19 years old showing up with these really, really high BMI percentiles. And so, when we look at percentages of pediatric obesity in the United States, so this is a little bit older. This is from 2019, but this is the most updated CDC graph. You can see, and this is with obesity. So these are children that are over this 95th percentile. In Georgia, we're here at 15 to 19%. And this is up from about 5% in 1960. So it has been increasing. And this is a global sort of World Health Organization graph of children. So they characterize it a little bit different. So it's children and adolescents aged 15 to 19 years old that are defined as, and this is a combination of overweight and obesity. So you can see that the US here on average is at 41.5%. So obesity is kind of an increasing, or pediatric obesity is an increasing issue. And so why does it matter? Why do we care? So as I mentioned, it is possible to be overweight and healthy. With obesity, particularly with the more sort of severe cases of obesity, there's an association with all of these many different diseases, chronic diseases. Type 2 diabetes, we're starting to see kids present as like pre-diabetic, hypertension. This is a very deadly condition. Liver disease, we're seeing kids now that are showing up with fatty liver. Reproductive disorders, so it can affect reproductive health and even reproductive development. So we know adolescence is a time of reproductive development. Obesity can impact that. Heart disease, susceptibility to heart disease, mood disorders, and cancer risks. So these are all things that, and I don't know why this is, so as I mentioned, so there's a lot of comorbidities, and it's associated with early mortality. And this is especially true due to cardiometabolic disease or colon cancer. And these associations with early mortality go down if you're able to treat the pediatric obesity. So if you're able to promote weight loss. However, adolescents who are obese are also likely to have obesity in adulthood. So about 80% of adolescents of obesity will continue to have obesity in adulthood. And it's so difficult to treat that for many years, we were just recommending prevention, right? Because it's like, once you have obesity, my friend likes to say, once you're a pickle, you can't go back to being a cucumber. So like, once you have it, it's really difficult to treat. And we're going to kind of get into a little bit of why that is the case. So what causes pediatric obesity and why is it so difficult to treat? So I'm going to get into a little bit of energy metabolism. So the equation of how body weight is regulated. We've all heard the phrase calories in equals calories out. and that is what is considered to be in energy balance. So calories in, we're talking about the food that we're eating. And then for calories out, we're talking about energy expenditure. And energy expenditure has 3 different components to it. There's basal metabolism, and this is basically the number of calories that you burn to just sort of be alive and live your life, right? We don't have control over this, right? And in a large part, basal metabolism is predicted. It tends to be predicted by people's body size already, right? Your the lean mass that you have, your body size, it predicts your basal metabolism. And then on top of that, we have activity. Activity is defined, so we know about exercise, talk about exercise, but the majority of activity is made up of this non-exercise activity. Like me, I'm talking with my hands right now. This is the kind of activity that I'm talking about. So the majority of the energy expenditure calories burned that we have is due to just sort of like normal things, doing the laundry, gardening, walking to our car, walking into the grocery store, things like that. That is the large part of our activity. You can go to the gym for 30 minutes or 40 minutes a day and increase your exercise activity, but it's still going to make up a very small percentage of your total daily activity. And this is really diverse. Some people are naturally like really high movers, and some people are not. And it's interesting because as a neuroscientist, when we're studying the brain, sometimes we play with different circuits in the brain. I'll explain more about that later. We use animal models, and you can see there are very specific pathways that can be manipulated that can increase the animal's tendency to just fidget or just be slightly more active around the cage. So a lot of that is largely outside of our control, whether we have this propensity. And then thermic, that's like what we do to keep ourselves warm, but also the thermic effect of food. So when you eat food, there's a calorie burn that goes into, metabolizing that food. So this is just heat, basically, heat energy. So when we're in energy balance, calories in equals calories out. When we're in positive energy balance, this is what causes obesity. So would be where intake goes up and energy expenditure goes down. And when we're in negative energy balance, this is what causes weight loss. So intake goes down, energy expenditure goes up. But in the same environment, so these are 2 Labradors. They're raised in the same house, right? Imagine you have one that clearly has obesity, and then the other one that does not. And so what causes this variation? Well, it was found that about 25% of Labradors have a genetic type that promotes overeating. And this is due to this genetic type causes low levels of a certain type of neurotransmitter. And these are why there's this stereotype, right, with Labradors that they're thinking about food all the time. And so there's a basis for this stereotype, and it has to do with the brains of these Labradors. So in the brain, we have neurons. So these are the cells in the brain that communicate. So here's a neuron that I have depicted. It's got dendrites on it. So these are like the little processes that the neurons have. You may recognize these also from like, when you watch commercials for like medications, antidepressants and stuff like that. They always talk about the synapse. So synapse would be, you have these dendrites and they're receiving information from these axon terminals through something called the synapse, and the signals that they're receiving are neurotransmitters. So famous ones are like dopamine and serotonin, but there's lots of neurotransmitters that are not talked about as quite as often as dopamine and serotonin. And these neurotransmitters are transmitted. So there's electrical signals that go from one neuron to another neuron, and then it causes the release of these neurotransmitters. And then those neurotransmitters will trigger an electrical signal in the next neuron, and that is how the brain communicates. So there's a brain region called the hypothalamus that is well known for regulating body weight. So when they first started doing these studies looking at the hypothalamus, it was very it was very eye-opening, right? Because at the time, I think the impression that you get, especially after doing research in this area, is, wow, if it's that simple that you can manipulate these different neurons and you can see this dramatic response in behavior, in eating behavior, or in energy expenditure, or in physical activity, then how much control do we really have over, whether we're making decisions to do certain behaviors, and how much of it is our brain just regulating our activity levels and our food intake. So in the hypothalamus, there's a type of brain cell called a POMC neuron, and POMC neurons make a type of neurotransmitter. So this circle right here this is our place in the hypothalamus. It's called the arcuate nucleus. But there's it's a region of the brain that neuroscientists love to study, even if they're not that interested in obesity or eating behavior or anything like that. And the reason is eating behavior is a very easy behavior to measure if you're trying to use tools that turn different types of cells on or off, right? It's very obvious. You can look at an animal and you can know whether it's eating or not in front of a bunch of food. So a lot of neuroscientists study this particular brain region because there are these two types of neurons. And this is like, the POMC neurons are like the brakes for eating. When it responds to cues in the body related to energy balance, so cues like hormones that get released when you eat food, or food metabolites, so different, or circulating glucose, things like that, so circulating sugars. So the POMC neurons are sensing, right? They have access a little bit to the blood, and they're sensing what's in the blood, and they respond after you've eaten a meal by activating. And when these cells activate, it triggers a response that reduces food intake and increases energy expenditure, right? So back to the Labrador example, these Labradors have a genetic deletion in this POMC gene. So these POMC neurons, they make a neurotransmitter from POMC, from the gene that has POMC. They lack this gene, and that causes them to basically not have an off switch. And it's about 25% of Labradors that don't have this functional POMC gene. Interestingly, these dogs are incredibly easy to train because they're so food motivated. So that's part of why they're often used as guide dogs. So there is, this food motivation, and giving them treats as a reward makes it so that they're very easy dogs to train. But okay, so that's talking about, that in the brain, there are cells that are sensing whether we've just eaten or not. And these cells turn off our drive to eat. And partially how we know that is these dogs and other animal models, when they don't have these cells, we can see that they have hyperphagia, meaning they just don't have an off switch when it comes to eating. But that's only one side of the equation. So on the other side of the equation is energy expenditure. So how much does our genetics contribute to energy expenditure? I said some people are more fidgety than others. Some people are high movers. Some people have higher, thermic effect of food, or higher body heat, right? These kinds of things. Higher basal metabolism. So this was a study that was done. This was done a long time ago, where they took identical twins and they overfed these twins, excuse me, by about 1,000 calories per day for 84 days. So it takes 3,500 calories to gain a pound of fat. or you have to be in a deficit of about 3,500 calories to lose that pound. So that's just a general calculation. So they overfed these twins by about 1,000 calories per day for 84 days, and they were sedentary. I did the calculation of like about how much they should gain, and I have it in my notes, but I'm not going to look at them right now. So when they did this, so this is a graph where on the x-axis you have change in body weight in kilograms. So 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. And so here we have twin A on the y-axis and twin B on the x-axis. So, so two twins, they're all overfed by the same amount. If what you would predict to happen if the twins gained or lost weight similarly to each other is that they would fall directly on this line. And you can see that mostly they're close. In most of the case, if twin B gained, this one gained 13 kilograms, this one gained 11, right? So they're not quite on the line, but they're pretty close. So for the most part, some pairs of twins gained only 8 kilograms, some pairs of twins gained more, but by and large, the twins gained a similar amount of weight to each other, suggesting that their genetics was playing a big role of determining how much weight they gained by being overfed. Now, the amount that they calculated to overfeed them was based on the twins' body weight to begin with. So each pair of twins was being overfed by a similar amount. Same thing was true with body fat gain. So this is suggesting that the genetics of these identical twins was playing a big role in regulating their energy expenditure to determine how much weight they were going to gain based on being overfed by similar amounts. So twins respond similar to each other by long-term overfeeding. And responses to overfeeding in the absence of exercise are largely out of our control. I say this because there have since been lots of twin studies that have been done looking at obesity in identical twins. And for the most part, twins tend to match up with each other, even if they're raised in different environments. With the exception, the thing that really changes the equation is whether one twin exercises or not. So exercise causes a lot of changes outside of just the calorie burn of exercising to things like metabolic rate, basal metabolism. Exercise causes changes in eating behavior, all kinds of things that can actually change this equation. So we know that basal metabolic rate is largely predicted by body mass. So the size you are is going to predict your calorie burn on a given day. So yeah, and most people fall pretty predictably along this line, with the exception of what happens with obesity. So there was a study that was done, and I know this show did not age well and is very controversial, but there was a show that was on TV called The Biggest Loser. And this show, I think it was in like the 90s and 2000s. Maybe it was just the 2000s. I don't know. But contestants would go on this show and they would lose a tremendous amount of weight using very extreme measures. And what ended up happening, so then this woman, Jennifer Kearns, she was a contestant on the show. And then after the show, she went to medical school and she became an obesity researcher and published a study with Kevin Hall looking at so one of the things that they noticed is that many of the contestants that were on the show, The Biggest Loser, gained the weight back after the show and then some. And this is very common with obesity. We watch Oprah struggle for years, right, with losing weight and then gaining the weight back and then some, and then losing weight and then gaining the weight back. And through most different mechanisms of weight loss, this is almost always the case. It's and the question is really why that is. So what they found in this study that was of the Biggest Loser contestants is that there was a persistent metabolic adaptation that happened. So obesity caused long-term changes to basal metabolic rate. So, for example, Jennifer Curran. So, if you were to take somebody who was her size, who had never been obese, and look at her energy expenditure, what they did is they brought them into these. They had these rooms. They're called indirect calorimetry rooms, where they measure all of the oxygen that you breathe and the carbon dioxide that you breathe out. That's how they measure your energy expenditure. Because that oxygen consumed and carbon dioxide breathed out is related to your metabolism. And so they put these people in these rooms where they were able to measure their energy expenditure. And what they found is that, so in a person Jennifer's size who had not previously been obese, you might predict, based on that line graph that I showed you, that her energy expenditure might be something like, 1,300 calories a day if she doesn't do anything, right? Just living her life, no activity at all. That basal energy expenditure, or resting energy expenditure. What they found instead is that people who were previously obese, their energy expenditure was more like 800 calories a day or 600 calories a day, meaning anything in excess of that, and they were going to gain weight. And so basically, what they showed in this study was something that had been studied previously by James Hill and Paul MacLean, which was showing that there's something that happens after weight loss called this energy gap. And what it is after weight loss, energy expenditure goes way down and hunger goes way up. And this is not just like, man, I miss eating, some of my favorite foods kind of. This is like hunger, like, like when you're really thirsty and you haven't had a drink in a long time and you're just like, I need water. It's like, I need food now. I am hungry. So this is not just like people missing a couple of extra cookies after dinner or something like that. This is true hunger. And anyway, so that there was this incredible energy gap. And this is suggesting that after there's a biological drive to regain weight that happens in individuals who are previously obese that makes things way more complicated than just, that where behavioral interventions may struggle to actually be super useful. And that people who are previously obese are dealing with an entirely different deck of cards when it comes to body weight management than people who have never been obese. And the question is why that is. And more we've been finding out that this has to do with the brain. So, oopsies. Here's an example. So this is the human study. This has also been done in rats. So this is a lab rat study that was done. And basically, I'm going to walk you through this graph. So this is time in weeks. So what they did is they took lab rats and they fed them high-fat, high-sugar diet for a long time, like 16 weeks. And what you see is predictably animals, they gain a bunch of weight on this diet. So this is a 700-gram rat. That's pretty big. That's almost... we're almost close to like a kilogram. This is like pizza rat size. This is a very large rat. I don't know if you've seen that rat in the subway in New York that was dragging the slice of pizza. It was a big rat. So they're out here. And what they did then is they put them on a calorie restricted diet. So they restricted their diet and then they maintain them on this restricted diet for different lengths of time. So they switched the food from a high-fat, high-sugar diet to a healthy, high-fiber, low-fat chow diet. And they maintain them on this diet for different lengths of time. And what they found is that the longer that they maintain them at this restricted weight, the faster the rats regain the weight when they allowed them to eat as much as they wanted. And they allowed them to eat as much as they wanted of the healthy diet. They didn't switch them back to the high fat, high sugar diet after this. So this is kind of an example of what happens with weight loss with obesity. And this is why in that beginning, when I showed the definition of obesity, they define it as a chronic relapsing neurobehavioral disorder disease. Because almost always with weight loss, there is weight regain, and it is almost never like it. And this is due to very real physiological factors and changes that occur post-obesity. So as an interim study, we know that the brain regulates energy intake and energy expenditure. I'm going to talk more about that. And let's see. We have very little control of energy expenditure. So body composition changes can increase energy expenditure. Physical activity can increase energy expenditure. But by and large, a lot of that stuff is regulated by our own brains, our own hypothalamus, that send signals that impact our basal metabolism. We also have very little control over food intake. So this all sounds quite bleak.
Before you go on, Emily, we've had, I guess, question/comment in the chat. I have read that gut health is critical for weight loss or gain, which connects with the brain.
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, that's a great comment. Great. Yeah. So gut microbiome is a very active area of research, and there are studies that have been done to show that the gut microbiome. So there have been studies that have been done where they've taken gut microbiota from humans with obesity, and they've transferred them to rats, and they've shown that that particular gut microbiome can promote weight gain in rats as well. Absolutely, the gut microbiome, especially in adolescents and pediatric populations. So when we're born, we don't have our gut microbiome is first colonized by our mothers when we're born, right? So the gut microbiome of babies that are born vaginally looks a lot more like the vaginal microbiome of the mother, and the gut microbiome of babies that are born through C-section looks more like the skin microbiome, actually. So the first bacteria that are introduced at that early life time, and then everything is really variable for about 3 years. And at that time, our immune system, so the gut is one of the places that has the most sort of our enteric immune system decides in a way, like, what our gut microbiome is going to end up looking like. I mean, in combination with the gut bacteria that are there. So it's like all these different bacteria in the first 3 years of life are kind of fighting for like position, who's going to stay there. And then throughout life, diet can have an effect on your gut microbiome. But it only to the extent to which the immune system allows certain bacteria to be there or not. And so early life development is actually a really critical time for the establishment of what your gut microbiome is going to be like. And what's interesting is brain development is happening at that time. And without a healthy gut microbiome, the brain doesn't develop the same way. So mice that are raised in a germ-free environment, they don't, they end up having really high anxiety-like behavior profiles. They have some learning and memory deficits. And if you introduce a microbiome from another animal during that early life phase, they'll develop they won't have those anxiety problems or those learning and memory deficits. But if you wait until they're adults to introduce a healthy microbiome, it doesn't improve that learning and memory function. So I'm glad you brought up the gut microbiome. There is research to suggest that obesity and the gut microbiome can be linked, but the state of that research is still pretty young, relatively young. When I was in grad school, was really when the first sort of surge in gut microbiome research started. And there's so like it's so early that it makes me really nervous when people start talking about like taking probiotics and taking specific type of bacterial populations, because I'm like, we don't actually really, this is a really early field still. And the consequences of that, I'm not sure we're ready to play with that yet. But anyway, that's my opinion. You didn't ask for my opinion, but that's my opinion. Yes, so I'm glad you brought up the gut microbiome. Sorry, that was a long tangent. Also, I don't have a clock in front of me, so Diane, will you tell me if I'm running long?
Sure, glad to. It's you've got about 25 minutes left
Okay.
today.
Okay. All right. So this brings me to talking about very little control over food intake. This brings me to Oprah. So there's a very hot topic now in obesity research, which is this concept of food noise. And it was a term that was only recently defined, I think, because people started noticing that they were taking medications for obesity, specifically the GLP-1 medications, which are things like Ozempic and Wegovy, and or Manjaro, Zepbound. So one of the things that they realized, this is what Oprah said. One of the first things that she realized the very first time she took a GLP-1 was that all these years she thought that thin people just had more willpower. Then she realized for the very first time that she took the GLP-1, oh, they're not even thinking about it. They only eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're full. So this illustrating this idea of Oprah was saying, I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner while I'm actively eating breakfast, and that people who don't have that same tendency are like, I had no idea. So this is just to illustrate the point that like, we don't really have as much control as we think. Okay. So anyway, all of this together in the context of pediatric obesity, is really just to say that we know that once pediatric obesity is like, once these kids have obesity, that they're going to have a very hard time losing that weight and keeping it off for the rest of their lives. And for that reason, it's been recommended that obesity in children is treated using very like aggressive interventions. And I think I might just skip ahead to that parts of the talk because of, in the interest of time. Oops, continue to share. Can you guys still see my talk?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I don't have that much time left. So I'll just skip ahead to here. Diane knows I had this problem last time. I just get so excited and then I take too long. All right, play from current slide. Continue to share. Okay, so as I mentioned, American Academy of Pediatrics said that principal healthcare providers should offer adolescents 12 years and older with obesity, weight loss pharmacotherapy according to medication indications, risks, and benefits as an adjunct to health, behavior, and lifestyle treatment. So, what are the medications that are being offered now to treat obesity? There are the GLP-1 medications. So semaglutide, retatrutide is one that's in phase 3 clinical trials that's just coming out. There's this amylin analog, tirzepatide, which is a GLP-1 and a GIP receptor co-agonist. So there's a bunch of them. This one, the setmelanotide, this treats a rare genetic obesity, which is the MC4 receptor. That is the receptor that the protein that the POMC gene makes. It's the receptor that acts on. So there's very few types of monogenic obesity out there, but one of them is involves this POMC MC4 receptor system. So anyway, that's another one. So what are these medications that everyone is talking about and all these celebrities are taking, and these GLP-1 receptor agonists? So when I started when I was in grad school, I remember, or even as a postdoc, I remember going to conferences and seeing presentation after presentation about GLP-1s and thinking, this is so saturated. Why is everybody studying GLP-1s? And the reason is, so what is GLP-1? So GLP-1 is a hormone that's produced, it's produced in the L cells of the intestine. So it's produced by the gut. And it was found very early on that this GLP-1 could help with blood sugar regulation. So, and you may be asking, why do you have a lizard on the screen? So this is a Gila monster. It turns out that the GLP-1, so the issue with the GLP-1s that are produced by the gut, even though they were very beneficial in helping with blood sugar regulation, it was shown that they helped the pancreas to secrete insulin. So it could be very in a glucose dependent manner. So it could be very effective for helping people with type 2 diabetes. It could enhance the natural secretion of insulin from the pancreas. But the problem is that the GLP-1 that gets reduced by the gut or released by the gut, it's released and then it's degraded super fast. So it's when you eat a meal, right? There's cells in your intestines that will then trigger the release of this hormone, and that basically goes to the pancreas and it says, "Hey, help us release some insulin." And then we don't want to have that around forever because we want it to work only when you've just eaten that meal. So then in the blood, there are enzymes that break it down. Well, scientists found out. So this guy, J.P. Ralphman and John Eng, discovered and isolated a protein that is in the saliva of the Gila monster called exendin 4. And this protein, it's 53% identical to GLP-1, but it is resistant to being broken down by enzymatic degradation by the enzyme DPP4. So it can last in the blood for a really long time. And that resulted in the first GLP-1 medication, which was called exendin 4 or Byetta. That was improved for type 2 diabetes treatment in 2005. And then in 2017, Ozempic was approved for, this is a different version of a drug that's based on a similar concept. And Wegovy was approved for obesity in 2021. And then these are all Novo Nordisk, and this is Mounjaro, Zepbound is Eli Lilly. But anyway, these drugs are now we've seen that widespread use and even disturbingly by people who don't need to be using them. And it's a little unsettling because we don't actually know what the consequences in those circumstances of people taking these medications are. You probably don't need to see all of this, but I do want to say that there are several other medications that are coming out. This one is an oral GLP-1 receptor agonist. Retatrutide is even more effective for obesity and tends to preserve muscle mass as well, which is interesting. It's in phase 3 clinical trials, and this is about to be released. And then there's another one that acts on, anyway, but they have adverse side effects in particular. And so, which is a little concerning. So it is now recommended, and people are actively prescribing these medications for people with pediatric obesity. There's some side effects, major side effects, nausea being the biggest one, headaches, gastrointestinal issues. And part of that is one of the things that the GLP-1 does in the gut is it slows gut motility. So it's not recommended for people who have gastrointestinal diseases such as irritable bowel disease and gastroparesis. It honestly, to your gut microbiome question, it probably has very dramatic effects on the gut microbiome. We just did a study in our lab to show that this is unpublished, but we just did a study and we found that it actually reduces mitochondrial metabolism in the colon, in the cells of the colon. So anyway, so it's not without side effects. There are potential issues with people with long-term use for people who have who may be at risk for thyroid cancer. So, and then acute pancreatitis has been reported. But again, so it's a pretty young drug, and I think we're going to find out what the long-term consequences of using the drug are. And it's a peptide drug. There's been so much conversation about peptides. Been getting so many questions about peptides. A lot of the neurotransmitters that we studied, the ones that, even the famous ones that we know about, things like dopamine, serotonin, these are peptides. So what is a peptide? It's a short chain of amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So that's all they are. There's tons of peptides in the body. There's peptides in the gut. These are the ones that are being actively researched in obesity medicine. And the peptides that are released from the gut are the ones that are actually sending signals to the brain to say, hey, we don't need to eat anymore. Turn on those POMC neurons, it's time for the off switch to hit. There's also peptides that are appetitive, so they increase your appetite and that kind of thing. So how do these peptides work in the gut? So they communicate with the brain, and this is similarly, so one of the things of the gut microbiome is that gut microbiota actually they metabolize food as well, and they produce short-chain fatty acids. And those short-chain fatty acids can actually trigger the release of GLP-1 from the gut. So that's one way in which your gut microbiome can actually impact appetite. Because we know that GLP-1 release from the gut actually reduces food intake. So gut peptides communicate with the brain. They can do so either through activating receptors on the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that innervates, it's called cranial nerve X. It innervates the gut at multiple levels. It innervates the stomach, it innervates the small intestine, it innervates the large intestine, can communicate with the brain and things that regulate appetite. And then there's also potentially it could affect appetite in other or eating behaviors in other ways. For example, it can trigger the release of insulin, and we know that insulin acts in the brain to reduce food intake as well. So gut peptides also act on other organ systems. They can act locally in the gut to affect gastric motility, and that affects eating behavior as well, because we know that there's mechanical receptors as well throughout the gut that can send a signal to the brain just through stretch to say, like, hey, we had a lot of food in here, slow down eating, like we don't bring any more in, there's a lot here, so it can affect, so the slower your things are moving through, that will keep you fuller for longer. And then in normal physiology, these peptides are very short acting, but when they're pharmacologically modified, it can avoid enzymatic degradation. This is a very busy slide, but this is an example of the intestines. So we've got the intestinal lumen, which is where the food would be. And then we have different cell types throughout the gut. And then what is it that triggers the release of GLP-1 and GIP, which is just another gut hormone? That's the second part of tirzepatide. One of the things could be glucose. So the presence of glucose and fructose in the gut can trigger the release of GLP-1. Amino acid receptors can trigger the release of GLP-1. And so there's multiple different ways in which it can be released. Okay. But when it comes to pediatric obesity and treating pediatric obesity with GLP-1s, there's a lot of unknowns. And so thing about the GLP-1s and the drugs specifically is we know that they're working in part because they're directly impacting circuitry and cells in the brain. There's a lot of GLP-1 receptor in the brain. So this is an image of the brain, and this is just showing all the different locations in which there is GLP-1 receptor. Now, a lot of these, you may say, why is there GLP-1 receptor in the brain? If this is something that's primarily a gut hormone that's supposed to act in the pancreas, like, why do we have GLP-1 receptor there as well? especially if it gets released from the gut and then it gets degraded super fast. So the chances that it's actually ever going to see the brain would be normally, you would expect that they'd be really low. Well, it turns out that the brain makes its own GLP-1. So there's populations of cells in the brain that make their own GLP-1. They're called PPG neurons, and they're in a place called the hindbrain, the nucleus of the solitary tract of the hindbrain. And they're neurons that make GLP-1. And much like serotonin, there's a lot of things in common between the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system is the nervous system in our gut, is very similar to the nervous system in our brain in the sense that a lot of the neurotransmitters that are made are the same. So we have GLP-1 receptor in the brain, which is there to respond to GLP-1 neurons in the brain. So these drugs, we still don't know, like a lot of these brain regions, the GLP-1 drugs are probably not impacting because they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. They don't get into these deeper regions, but some of them they are. And scientists are still trying to figure out which regions are being impacted by the GLP-1 drugs that people are taking and which regions are not. And why this matters is that adolescence is a critical period of brain development. So the circuits, it's a time where there's a lot of neuroplasticity happening and your brain hasn't really fully decided who it's going to be yet, how it's going to be set up or organized completely. And so the activity and the environmental exposures that you get exposed to during adolescence can shape your long-term self. Like they can shape how your brain responds, to in the long term. And when it comes to the GLP-1 drugs, we just don't know what those results are going to be. So we don't know the extent to which the brain is going to be impacted by using these drugs at this critical period of development. The pediatric medicine has decided, well, we do know that there are negative consequences on brain function that are associated with obesity during adolescence. And so they're like, maybe, that plus all of the risks of early mortality, metabolic disease, the fact that it's very, very difficult to reverse once obesity occurs during pediatric obesity occurs. I think that a decision was made that the potential benefits may outweigh the potential risks. However, I think we still need to know a little bit more about the consequences of long-term use. And it's important to know that adolescents are already taking these medications. So in 2022, it was approved that adolescents could take GLP-1 agonists as young as 12 years old. And rapidly, adolescents have been adopting these medications. Prescription rates for semaglutide, so that's a GLP-1 agonist in adolescents, has really increased from 2023 to 2024. I'm sure it's like, we don't have the data yet, but I'm sure it's way higher now. And it's largely based on this one clinical trial, the approval of these drugs. And there were no serious adverse effects that were reported in this clinical trial. But again, with clinical trials, you only measure what you're looking for. So there were no sort of effects of long-term, like neurobehavioral studies or anything like that. They didn't even look, surprisingly, at body composition changes. So they only looked at change in BMI. So that's weight and height are in that calculation. And they found that the semaglutide use was very effective at promoting weight loss. About 15% weight loss was achieved. This is typical for the GLP-1 analogs. About 15% change occurs. Then they took them off the medications at 68 weeks, and they only followed up on them for an additional 7 weeks before they ended the study. And this was the major study that allowed for the approval of these medications in children as young as 12. There's minimal, there's not a lot done also on looking at, well, you may say some 12-year-olds are pre-puberty and some 12-year-olds are post-puberty. What are the reproductive consequences? Things like that. We still don't know that information. So, what were the endpoints that led to the conclusion of safety? So there are no differences in cardiometabolic measures. There were no severe adverse events, so there was no severe hypoglycemia episodes or deaths. There's no clinically significant changes in hematological, biochemical, hormonal, lipid, or urinary measurements. But there were limited endpoints. So there was no lean mass, fat mass, bone mineral density. We also know that adolescence is a time where, you're really trying to accumulate bone mass that can have long-term effects on health. And we just don't know what the long-term change effects are. We also know that, like, for example, circuits that are involved in regulating eating behavior. What are the long-term implications for taking these medications during early life?
Emily, we have about 4 minutes left.
All right. Well,
And,
I'm not going to get into the next part then. So the next part I was going to tell you about the studies that we're doing in a rodent model to kind of address some of these unknown questions. But I won't get into that part. But what I will say is that thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm going to leave you with maybe this slide. This is our group. And then we'll just take questions from there.
and we've had several questions come in. First of all, let's definitely thank Emily. I don't know if you would be amenable to a part two, but I feel sure that a lot of us would love to hear more about some of the other things that you have to say. One question that came in was specifically about GLP-1s. Sorry, I'm trying to get it in right. If there's a struggle with side effects like nausea and feeling sick, does one of the GLP-1s work better than the others as far as side effects? Are there ones that are better than the others related to that?
So there are some people are sensitive to some more than others. The GLP-1 GIP, you can tighter the dose down a little bit. It's a little bit more effective, and that could be beneficial for some people. This retatrutide that's coming out is about to take the world by storm. And I haven't seen, from what I've read, there's potentially fewer side effects with that one. It does seem to be that the GLP-1 is really the very nausea promoting, and that by adding these other gut peptides, you can reduce the amount of the GLP-1 that is in the drug, and then it's still effective. So yeah,
Right.
but that's the thing that, like, usually a doctor can help with, like, titrating the different, trying the different drugs. But
And then we've also had sort of a big question that I don't know if we have a lot of time to address, but wondering how beyond just physiological factors, things like trauma or mental health issues can contribute to obesity or eating related issues, and do those carry into adulthood? Things like eating for overeating for comfort and things like that. I know
yeah,
that's a big, big question.
big question. And this kind of gets at the food noise thing with Oprah. So, and some additional questions about how these medications are working. It does seem that they are having effects on eating in the absence of hunger, like reducing the desire to eat in the absence of hunger. So, I had a whole part of the talk that is more about, like, the psychology of eating. But I skipped over it for time. But people, so there's different reasons why people eat and overeat. Some people are really sensitive to cues around food, and that can be both, like, external cues, like the smell of food or the sight of food, or, and that can drive impulsive eating behavior. And then it could also be internal cues, like those hormones that are circulating. Some people are more sensitive to those. So eating in the absence of hunger seems to be something that these GLP-1 medications addresses. Now, and if we understood more about why those medications address that type of eating, then we might understand better how adolescent use of the medications might be affecting long-term brain development. That's something that my lab is really interested in studying. So there are certain brain regions that are in a critical period in development. You probably have heard prefrontal cortex, for example, the hippocampus. These are brain regions that regulate inhibitory control. So they regulate whether people are going to be impulsively responding to these cues related to eating. And we know that there's tons of GLP-1 receptor in, for example, the hippocampus, and specifically in the places of the hippocampus that project to the prefrontal cortex. So whether you can activate that pathway a lot during adolescence and cause enhanced inhibitory control long term due to that's a very much an open question that we're really interested in investigating. And we would do that in like an animal model first, and then see what happens, and then look at it in humans as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I'm going to stop the recording.